This is Josh Reeves, and you're listening to the Mile High Church podcast. Hey, check out our YouTube channel to find all sorts of additional content, including Mile High Insight, which is a weekly reflection from one of our ministers, old services, new services, all sorts of stuff. Check us out.
And this morning, I want to invite you to observe some of the beauty that has bloomed here on our campus. In honor of the Divine Feminine, we have two artists that are showing and sharing their work with us. You can go out in the hallway here of our Teal Sanctuary and you can experience the art of Lisa Tolucci. She creates shadow boxes of the Divine Feminine, of Mother Mary, and you will experience her beautiful works out there. And also, if you'll venture over to our community center, we have a display of the really exquisite photography of Ted Takichi. And Ted is blind, and he creates these gorgeous photographs. But then underneath, you'll also notice that there is a visual representation of the photograph and a braille explanation there. So I hope that you will experience the gift of their art. Today we're going on a bit of a pilgrimage together, and we're going to bask in the energies and the creations of the master builders, in the creations that they created for us in the Gothic cathedrals and the temples of the medieval period. And I myself was called on pilgrimage in 2014. I answered the call and I went to Chartres, France, and I walked through the 120-foot tall and 54-foot wide doors of Chartres Cathedral and entered into an experience, a threshold experience. And if you have been there, I've been there several times since, but if you have been there, as you enter through, you leave the world of the mundane behind, the Twitter of the city of Chartres, France all around you, and you enter into the darkness of the nave. And in those days, in 2014, it was still quite dark. It was much the experience as in the medieval times where the only light, or most of the only light filtering through, was from the stained glass windows, who are mostly completed in the Chartres blue. And so you walk through this filtered blue light. And as I allowed my eyes to adjust to the darkness, there what emerged before me was, as many of you may know, embedded in the floor, a masterpiece of a medieval labyrinth. And I had gone there to step foot on that labyrinth, to experience the energy of that labyrinth. And as I began to walk, I was moved to tears. And these weren't tears that were connected in any way to a sort of thought that I was having. These were tears that spontaneously arose from within me because I could feel the energy of the pilgrims that had walked that path for centuries before. And I continued along the path of that labyrinth. I completed it, and I continued to walk through the beauty and take in the cathedral. And I came face to face with the caretaker of the cathedral that day. And he was standing at the greeting table, and he was holding a pilgrim shell in his hand and for donations to the cathedral. He had just been from the countryside to pick every day. He would go out there and pick this bouquet of flowers, which he would place upon that greeting table. And what ensued for the next few moments as we began to converse with one another, it was a bridge that we were able to build between us, that formed between us. And with my non-existent French and his broken English, we had a conversation of interconnectedness that day that culminated in a beautiful, tearful serenade where he sang to me, he's got the whole world in his hands. And I could feel the wonderment that was created by embarking on this journey within this masterpiece of a cathedral. You know, and I wasn't just feeling the connection with the caretaker that day. I was feeling a connection with the Druids who built on this sacred site before the cathedral that rose there. I was feeling the connection with the clergy and the bishops that tended this cathedral throughout the years, the patrons from the community, and I was feeling a connection, a sense of the exquisiteness of the team of stonemasons and master builders and artisans that had come together over decades to construct this cathedral. Chartres Cathedral has been referred to as a model of the universe, a triumph of the medieval mind, a library, a living book. A living book because there are biblical narratives that are embedded into the stained glass that surrounds all the walls, in the sculptures and the very architecture through which the cathedral is built. Embedded because the medieval public largely was illiterate. And so they would come there and they would sit inside this cathedral in order to absorb the wisdom and the teachings, to allow them to be revealed as they would gaze at these windows. That was their scripture. And so architect John James, he has visited 1,740 of these medieval cathedrals built in the Paris Basin from 1100 to 1250. And he found that the master builders were constructing these universes of stone, as he writes, to be symbols of paradise, to be a slice of eternity itself. They were made to represent the most divine things on earth. And they built it with the idea that they could create in form an experience of God's essence, built from the very things from the mundane world that surrounded it. All these masterpieces have in common that they were designed with sacred numbers, geometry. And it wasn't limited to the medieval cathedrals. They were also, during this time, master builders in Cambodia. I don't know if you've had the chance to go to the Denver Science Museum of Nature and Science recently, but they have an exhibit right now of Angkor Wat, the largest temple structure known in the world, which was also built during the medieval times. And what these all have in common, as I was saying, they have these sacred numbers embedded within, the sacred geometry. They are constructed with images of divine resonance so that they guide people through pathways and tunnels and enclaves and altars deep into mystical experience. The path from the entry often guides one on the journey within. You enter into the nave coming from the word navy, which literally had these overtones in the Christian lineage of the ark, an idea that within the cathedral we enter into a sanctuary that shelters us from the boundless fears of the deep waters of life. And so you enter into the nave, and the journey is to move from the world of the mundane into a world of a consciousness of protection, taking shelter in an awareness of God. John James continues, he says, as one sat within these temples, layers of meaning would tumble over one another, layer upon layer, until the mind would give way under the weight of it all. The master builders of these temples and cathedrals worked over decades. They showed up time after time. They would show up after someone had been building for 10 years, and they would pick up where that team left off, and they would continue on the labyrinthine journey of life's challenges. You know, they didn't have the support of today's digital technology. They didn't even often have paper, because that was used exclusively and saved for the illuminated manuscripts. But they would place it stone by stone, and they would work together. Teams, masons, artisans, patrons, bishops, all of them interconnecting to bring about and raise the vision. And I'd like us to consider today that these marvels of construction reflect our own divine architecture. You are the master builder of your own experience of God. In his book, The Gene Keys, Richard Rudd writes extensively of how the very blueprint of the cosmos is found within us. He says, you are the architect of your evolution. When you fully embrace the implications of this truth, then your journey, referring to transformation, has begun. He says, inside each of us lies a vast potential, a vast beauty, and it is limited only by the way we see ourselves and the world around us. And with that, he invites us to take a moment to look at this marvel of a divine blueprint, our hand. If you feel called, consider your own hand, looking at this marvel representing that there are 60 trillion cells that make up your body. Imagine the number of cells right here in this room right now. 60 trillion cells times 500 and some people. And then take a look, see the masterpiece of your very own fingerprint, your maker's mark. See, if you want to, consider that if you look at your index finger and you look at the different segments from one to the other, they extend, they lengthen ever so slightly as you move down your index finger. And do you know what that ratio is? It is 1.618, the Fibonacci sequence ratio, also known as the golden ratio, also found in the spirals of the galaxy, also found in the simplest of the snail's shell, found in the spiral of the rose petals. You are the master builder, architect, stonemason, and the shaper of your life. And so we're going to explore 3 ways this morning of how we can begin to co-create with this in mind. And the first one is to do what we just did, to bow at the altar of your being, to begin to rehearse. You know, whenever you're creating any masterpiece, you start with that blueprint. You start with the awareness of the divine construction. You start with the awareness that you are co-creating with this essence of spirit within. And you begin to take the divine in mind and heart. In Sufism, one of the names for God is Bismillah. It was a name given to me by my own Sufi teacher. Bismillah literally means to begin in the name of Allah, to begin in the name of God. And so it is said at the beginning of prayers, it is said at the beginning of spiritual practices, and it is said with the intention to honor and remind oneself that we begin in reverence to God, with God, in God. And so our spiritual practices allow us to rehearse and to connect more deeply with this awareness of God, that which is found within us, and also is recognized in all that we see, in whom we meet, and embedded in all. Recently, in the Sky Mind Sangha that I attend, there was a discussion about the Hebbian learning theory. Some of you may be familiar with it. A few years ago, it became very famous when the slogan or the tagline, neurons that fire together, wire together, you heard that. And it literally means that as we are thinking, as we rehearse certain thoughts, we create neural networks in our brain which shape the way that we experience reality. And so, it behooves us to rehearse thoughts of the divine, to saturate our daily life with contemplation of spirit. You know, a few weeks ago, I received a text out of the blue, from a prac-mate. And she sent me a text. She goes, I have a message for you. I need to talk to you right away. So, of course, I called her up, and she says, you need to pray the 91st Psalm. I said, oh, okay. And you know, it came at the perfect time. I had worked myself into a little one, ever one of those attitudes where, stress and buzzing around and busyness and all those things were kind of building up within my awareness. I was kind of adopting one of those little atmospheres of kind of stress and negativity, of tension. And she says, pray the 91st Psalm. She says, I had a time in my life where I was struggling so much at work and there was so much negativity going on and I was so scared. She says, I began to pray this, and within 3 weeks' time, everything had turned on its end in favor of the positive. And so I immediately went home and I dug out this little booklet. Maybe some of you have it. Maybe some of you have seen it. They still sell it on Amazon. You can get it, and it's called The Secret Place, A Key to the 91st Psalm by Emmett Fox. And in it, he takes the 91st Psalm and he goes line by line, verse by verse, and he says, he unpacks it so that it can be embodied, so its meaning can be applied within one's life. And he says that in this booklet, he says, when this is scientifically understood, it's found to be one of the most powerful prayers ever written. He also says prayer is essentially thinking about God. Not necessarily addressing God, but thinking about God. If you're familiar, the psalm starts out like this: He or she that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. And Emmett Fox teaches that this secret place of the Most High is our very own consciousness. It is our consciousness. It's not something to be accessed outside. It is literally the cathedral within us. And it's found by accessing, by contacting, by touching that place of the divine within. So the foundation to any creation in our life, even if it's the simplest act of constructing your own feeling set point for the day, begins with taking shelter in the consciousness, in your own consciousness of the divine, and showing up in reverence at the altar of your own being. In Sufi practice, in many faith traditions, the altar of God is found within one's heart. So take refuge here. And that leads us to the second way, and that is to trust the labyrinth of your life. If you've ever walked the labyrinth, we have one right out front. If you've ever walked it, you might be familiar with the ebbs and the flows. And have you ever been moving? You know that all the pathways lead to the center, but have you ever gotten close to the center and then the path leads you way over here? And you're like, well, I thought I was getting, and then, there's a moment of that mental chatter and that uncertainty, like, I know I'm getting back there, but isn't that just like life? Isn't that just like life, that we have those unexpected turns that send us far out into perhaps a moment where we must face the shadows, face the wounded parts of ourselves, or face the challenges, unexpected challenges in ourselves, in our own life, in the world around us. There's a saying that my dear prayer partner brought into our prayer time this week. She said, "The way knows the way, Zemirah. The way knows the way," which speaks of us to trust, to surrender into allowing ourselves to be held, as Jamie so beautifully sung, in the arms of Spirit, to be held in the hands of Spirit, and to open to that. The way knows the way. Poet and cantadora, keeper of the old stories in the Latina tradition, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, shares a story that illustrates this beautifully. She writes about her meandering journey with the task of building a shrine to La Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe in her front yard shortly after she purchased her tiny bungalow in New Mexico. And her bungalow was part of a neighborhood where in that area, these bungalows were handmade and designed, built, not builder designed, but designed by those who were building them, buying them. But they came to be known as the broken dream homes. This tiny, beautiful, stuccoed one-room bungalow was set way back on the alley because the idea was that on this large lot, one day when the funds would manifest, they would build the bigger house, the dream house. But it remained empty because so often Those funds never materialized. So she was called to create a shrine, a blessing, a sense of guardianship, a reverence for her tiny home and for Our Lady Guadalupe. So to do this, she was going to follow the tradition of upending a 6-foot bathtub and then leaving 3 foot above ground, placing a statue of Guadalupe within, and then planting beautiful flowers around it. So she began to pray. She prayed for a strong soul with a shovel. She prayed and she prayed because this desert ground was so rough, and immediately she came face to face with a stonemason. He wasn't who she was expecting to show up. He was weathered by great difficulty in life. He limped. One of his legs was a struggle, and he had fallen under the dis-ease of alcoholism, so very often he was in a drunken state. She found when they came face to face, he assured her that he was the one for the job, but she started to wonder. So she went back into prayer, and she asked again, and she sat there and she listened, and she heard, "Yes, he is the one I have sent to you." And so they began. They began this journey together in the ways of the old by trading stories. And she said she went into these story times and she had so many questions and she got very few answers. She wanted to know how much it was going to cost, how long it was going to take, but she didn't get any of that. What she got is she began to learn that polio had rendered one of his legs nearly useless, that he was abandoned by his parents at age 8. He ended up in foster care, and he had struggled for most of his life in very dangerous situations, both emotionally and physically. And they traded those stories. She began to share stories of Guadalupe. She told him how the Blessed Mother had appeared to Juan Diego on a hill in Mexico, this man of Aztec descent who was in the midst of living through a time of massive genocide, where it was either you converted to Christianity or you died. And how the Blessed Mother had come, she had appeared to the abandoned, those who were in greatest need. And for that, she is known as La Conquista, the conqueror, the mother of the conquered. She pours her strength into those who have been harmfully shocked or painfully treaded upon in life. And as the Grotto Project unfolded, the story moved from the bar to the bar restaurant to Clarissa's home. And she says what began as a 3-foot hole would become a year-long project, the creation of a refuge for Guadalupe, for the Divine Mother. The stone mason began to build a copper roof that sheltered the Divine Mother. He began to craft the lilies. Each lily petal, he completed a fountain and a flagstone path. And she said, his beauty and his creativity that had been marred by the haze of addiction began to emerge through the haze. And halfway through the project, he stopped drinking. He was done. Stone cold, stopped. And she writes, the parallel in all this was not lost on the stonemason or on me. That such a beautiful Guadalupe shrine, and also such beauty from the stonemason's own soul, could surface perhaps only at the House of Broken Dreams. Had the big house been built, there had been no room for Guadalupe or the grotto, or the stonemason's man's huge, bedraggled spirit to find its way home to him again. Sometimes, she writes, emptiness is not vacancy, but rather a long gestation. Gestation by the ego's measure is most often too long, but by the soul's measure, the length of the waiting and making within before what is being created shows on the outside is ever just right. And this brings us to our final way this morning, which is to reflect on the rose window of our interconnectedness. Indra's net is a metaphor used in both Hinduism and in Buddhism to illustrate the interconnectedness and interdependence of all things. The vast net is seen to represent the cosmos as an intricate lattice that is made up of jewels at every junction of the net. Within each individual jewel, all other jewels are reflected. Just as Clarissa Pinkola Estes reflected the inner soul beauty to the stonemason, just as they traded stories, they listened to one another deeply, they shared food together, that jewel of the divine nature began to emerge. And we are called to do that, first for ourselves, to recognize the divine within, and then to be reflections, to look for the reflections in each other. So we can catch a glimpse of our collective interconnectedness. But perhaps to do so, we first have to do so from a vantage point of beginning in the name of God, beginning in the image of the divine. Rilke wrote a poem entitled The Rose Window, and the final stanza reads like this. So, once, from a cathedral's dark facade, the great rose window seized and tore asunder the heart and dragged it down deep into God. We're going to close this morning with a bit of sound meditation to reflect on the blueprint of the divine within our own hearts. And I invite you to bow at the very altar of your own being as we move into this meditation, and to perhaps, with a bit of appreciation, with a bit of gentleness, with a bit of compassion for your own path and its meandering way that it has polished, the very awareness that you hold for the divine, the twists, the turns. And may you listen to the vibrations of sound and allow it to awaken the cathedral of your own heart. So you can begin to go within. What I know today is that we begin to release all that is ready to be released. So we deepen into an awareness, a connection of the divine spark, the divine nature, the very blueprint of the divine within. Feeling that interconnectedness, feeling a sense of the divine in all things, seeing the reflection of the divine in each other. And so it is.
Thanks for listening to the Mile High Church podcast. This podcast is made possible by the generous contributions from listeners like you. To make a donation, please visit milehighchurch.org.